Hi, this is Big Mark for America. Today is Tuesday, December 25th, 2018. It's Christmas Day, of course. I'm recording this for an international audience, so as you can tell by my name and by my accent, I'm an American. I'm in the United States. I'm specifically in South Carolina. In fact, I'm alongside of a federal highway here. You can hear traffic going by behind me. I'm in a cemetery, a fairly old one. A lot of these people were born in the 1800s and died in the early 1900s. It's a quiet, relaxing place. It is a beautiful Carolina day. Something we have down here frequently in the Carolinas in the wintertime. Not a cloud in the sky, a kind of a cool breeze, certainly cool by South Carolina standards, sunny. Of course, I'm not from South Carolina, more of a northern boy myself. This is the kind of a day that we would go swimming or sunbathing if it happened up north. Christmas Day, people have their new toys, and this is the Deep South. This is South Carolina. Some of those new toys include firearms, people spending their time with their families, and in the rural South, that a lot of times includes going out and shooting. So you will hear gunfire around me if you listen carefully enough. Okay. You can find me on Twitter at Big Mark for America, capital B, capital M, the number 4, and then capital A, Big Mark for America. And you can also find me at my blog, Big Mark for America, but instead of the number 4, it's spelled out FOR.org. And the purpose of today's podcast, it's going to be a long one, is to talk about the situation in South Africa. I'm beginning this at about 2:30 Eastern Standard Time here in South Carolina on Christmas Day. I'm not really sure where to begin, so I'm going to just jump into the middle with you and kind of take you through the process roughly the way I learned about what's going on. Okay, the mainstream media in this country has a political agenda. They don't mean to, they don't believe that they do, but they've been pretty heavily indoctrinated. If you go back and look at it, when the communists took power in the Soviet Union, it was bloody. And once they got power, they were intending to make that a world revolution. The Soviet Union was not intended to be a nation state. It was intended to be a union of Soviet socialist republics, headquartered in Moscow, but they were expecting to have at some point the German Soviet Socialist Republic, the Norwegian Soviet Socialist Republic. That's what they thought they were going to have. And in an effort to spread their world revolution, they got agitators and propagandists, agitprop, and they heavily funded them with resources that they didn't really have. They heavily funded these people basically to subvert the West, which is where they thought the revolution was supposed to happen. They thought it was supposed to happen in Germany and the British Isles, and instead it happened in a more agrarian Russia. And they mainly targeted the universities. They wanted to get professors indoctrinated so that those people would be preaching a left-wing Marxist, Leninist type of a doctrine, and everything would have that kind of a spin. So people that are studying biology or people that are studying economics or whatever it happens to be would at some point get exposed to some type of Marxist indoctrination. And their goal was to take over education, take over the government. Okay, they had a tremendous impact. As a result of that, a lot of these people that are in the mainstream media, they're trying to do a good job. They think they're doing a good job. They're making an effort. They do not realize the prejudices that they have. I think most of us don't realize the prejudices that we have. Why is that important? It is important because South Africa, the situation that's developing there, is at the cutting edge of these prejudices and these preconceived ideas that we have been indoctrinated with. So I would like you to be aware of that as you are learning about what's going on in South Africa. One of the main words you're going to hear slung about by people that are looking at it, you're going to hear them talk about racism and a lot of other things. You need to do your own research, as I have done. You need to keep digging, find out for yourself what the truth is. You're going to look at different material than I have looked at, perhaps. You are going to be looking at it from a different perspective, and you're perhaps going to come to some different conclusions. That's fine. Just make sure you're thinking for yourself and questioning what you're told. That most emphatically includes, I want you to question what I'm about to tell you now. Okay. I don't always pay a lot of attention to what the mainstream media says. They alert me to something happening somewhere, but if I'm really interested in it, I do my own digging to find out what's really going on, because I don't always trust one person's perspective or even the perspective of the entire industry. As a result of this, I get a lot of my information through non-conventional means. So for example, I will listen to talk radio, and not so much necessarily talk radio anymore as stuff that is broadcast over the internet, or it's available as podcasts over the internet, kind of like this is. And I find that people will go a lot more into depth. And another thing that they will do is they will tell you straight up front where they're coming from as they're discussing this. So they're not trying to pretend that they are not biased. Rather, they're telling you where their bias is from. And I'll go ahead and tell you where my bias is from. I'm a Republican. I'm conservative. Former military. I was in the Air Force. I was an intelligence applications officer. I speak some Russian. I also speak a few other languages. But I tend to be very conservative. That's conservative fiscally, conservative socially, and most emphatically regarding government. And what exactly is conservatism regarding government? That would probably be a topic for a different podcast. As a result of listening to these unconventional sources, podcasts, internet talk radio, I was introduced to a very brief series, there's only a couple of episodes, called The Truth About South Africa, by a young lady named Brendy Richards, who is from there. And she was talking to some people from South Africa, and the whole goal was to bring to a wider audience the truth about what's going on there. And so I listened. This was a few years ago, I believe it was year 2014. And I heard a few things mentioned kind of casual. I don't think she used the term farm attack, but there were incidents about, there was discussion of incidents that had happened on farms. And it sounded pretty horrendous, but, you know, life was happening and I moved on. So this summer, I came across this topic again as I was messing around online, on Twitter, and I came across the topic of farm attacks in South Africa. I do not like to just take for granted what people are telling me. I have to check the information myself. If it's important to me, I check. And so I like to find out if I'm being told correct information. I like to find out if the information is accurate, if it is provided with context so you can understand it. I like nuances in the information. So I started doing my own digging, and I came up with a lot of information on South Africa. So that's what this is about. Okay, here we go. It's so far about 10 minutes and 30 seconds, and we're just doing an introduction. Okay, so let me begin. What is a farm attack? These are criminal attacks on commercial properties, mainly in South Africa. These commercial properties tend to be owned by South Africans of European descent. We'll call them white people. Make it simple. And typically the perpetrators are people of African descent. We'll call them black people. There is a very high crime rate in South Africa. It is a murder capital. It is a rape capital. As I was looking up the statistics on it, I was very surprised to find out that South Africa compares favorably, just barely, to a lot of war zones as far as people dying violently. In South Africa, there's no war going on there, supposedly. However, if you look at certain jurisdictions, there's a place called Philippi East, and I may be mispronouncing that. The murder rate is so high that it compares unfavorably to Syria, which, as you know right now, that's where the Islamic State and civil war has been going on for years, and it's a very bloody war. And this particular jurisdiction in South Africa compares unfavorably to that. In other words, you'd be safer on average being in Syria in the middle of this civil war with the Islamic State than you would be in this particular jurisdiction of South Africa. Okay, big picture in South Africa, generally speaking, a lot of the so-called white people live in places that are a little bit safer. They tend to live in some of the more upscale areas and have better security. On average, the white people are not impacted by the crime quite so much, although it's very dangerous for them. It's dangerous for everybody. Who tends to be getting most of the crime? It's happening in the poorer black communities. However, if you look at the crime rate, one of the things that you'll notice, South African police get killed in the line of duty at a rate that's about 6 or 7 times the rate that we see here in the United States. And when I'm calculating that rate, the way I came up with that number is I look at the number of police officers killed in the line of duty compared to the population. Obviously, if you ran the number via different means, you might come up with something else. That was how I ran it, and I came up with it's about 6 to 7 times more dangerous to be a police officer there than here, as far as getting killed in the line of duty. Also, I haven't seen recent statistics, but as of a couple of years ago, the suicide rate for South African police, by the way, was spiking at about 70 times the average suicide rate for South Africa. Okay, be that as it may, big spike in high crime tends to be on average a little bit worse for the blacks than for the whites. Big spike for police. However, the bigger spike, a much bigger spike, was for white people in rural areas involved in commercial farming. Now, I didn't just say white people. I said white people in rural areas involved in commercial farming. If you take a look at that segment of society, they have the most dangerous job in the world right now. Much worse than being a police officer in South Africa. Why is that? And how is that happening? Okay, farm attacks are criminal attacks on these commercial agricultural areas, which are owned predominantly by white people. There are blacks that get victimized during the course of farm attacks, but let me give you the history on where the farm attacks came from so you can understand what I'm about to tell you about them. You have probably heard of the ANC, the African National Congress. If you go back and look in the early part of the 20th century, the ANC was an organization that had evolved, and they were pursuing generally peaceful means to try to share in power. South Africa was basically ruled by the white minority. They had a system there called apartheid. The key part of the word you need to think of is apartheid. It was a form of segregation. It was like segregation. All right, blacks lived in one area, whites lived in another. And the whites had the political power, certainly the lion's share of it. And the ANC was working against this. And they had been working against this peacefully. Okay, fine. In the late 50s, early 60s, right around 56 to 61 time frame, the ANC started interacting more with the communists. Now, you remember I mentioned the Soviet Union. You remember that I mentioned how they were trying to subvert the West. South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, was a first world country at the very tip, at the very southern part of Africa. As I'm recording this, it's Christmas Day here. It's the beginning of winter here in the United States. Guess what? It's the beginning of summer there. All right. If you're not real current on your geography, they're at the southern tip of Africa. And it was a first world country, very strong ally of the United States during World War II and also during the first Gulf War. The communists saw that South Africa, with a highly developed economy, with very good mineral resources, something I forgot to mention, was a key place in Africa, that if they could take South Africa, that would be a key move in the Cold War against the West. Of course, they were looking at infiltrating any rebel group they could find anywhere. You go back to the 1970s, pretty much every terrorist group in the world was getting some type of funding, some type of support from Moscow, except for the ones that weren't working with the Soviet Union. They were working with Communist China instead. But that's another story. And so the ANC, in the 56 to 61 time frame, began to look at communist ideology, Marxist-Leninist ideology. There's money and resources and training that comes from Moscow. When you accept their ideology, you get help. Nelson Mandela rose to prominence at this time, and he was a leader in moving in the direction of Marxism-Leninism with the ANC. Mandela founded the military wing of the ANC. We call it MK. It's got an African name that I don't know how to pronounce. But if you look it up, ANC, and you can look up MK, you'll see MK was kind of like the military wing. It's similar to, if you're familiar with the situation in the British Isles with Northern Ireland, there was the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and there was Sinn Féin, which was the political group. And so Sinn Féin and the IRA would be kind of like the ANC and the MK. All right. And the MK began this is what the ANC at this point was abandoning peaceful means and moving in the direction of militant means. Obviously, there are some internal dynamics to the ANC. All right, you still had a bunch of people that probably still believed in the peaceful means, but by this time, the people interested in violence were winning out. And the MK announced its presence with a series of bombings. Okay, they had bombings. They placed landmines in rural areas. When you conduct bombings in places like cafeterias and stuff like that, that's considered a war crime. Has been since after World War II. The rural landmines were indiscriminate. You don't know who or what is going to step on that. It might be somebody's cow. In the event, the problems that those landmines caused were black workers going on, for example, to some of these commercial farms that we're going to be talking about. Ultimately, the ANC-MK had to abandon the rural landmines because it was killing black people, and the blacks were the people that the ANC and MK said they were trying to liberate. Okay, so Nelson Mandela wound up in prison. He was imprisoned for terrorist activities, specifically sabotage. He took it in the direction of sabotage because he thought that that would be more likely to have an impact on the apartheid government in South Africa. He also thought that if you sabotage things, you're going to have a better chance at reconciliation later on. And so he wound up in prison for sabotage. And by the 1980s, he was sitting in prison, and the MK developed a new strategy. They decided to deliberately target commercial farms. Now, once again, these are civilian locations. They produce food. Deliberately targeting them as a military strategy is now considered a war crime. Has been considered a war crime since after World War II. And so the concept of the farm attack was born. Okay, this was in the 1980s. Another thing that came out of the 1980s in South Africa was necklacing. And necklacing is what they would do is they would take people, a lot of times they take a machete and hack their hands off. Then they would put an old tire around them, fill the tire, kind of like a necklace. That's where the term came from. Put some gasoline in the tire and toss a match. And obviously the person can't do anything. They just sit there and burn. It's a very horrid way to die. And a lot of times the person's remains, certainly by the standards of 1980s, were unidentifiable. To the west, the ANC tried, and by the way, and to liberals in South Africa, the ANC tried to portray this image that they weren't associated with this. However, their own communications to their supporters within South Africa, it was very obvious that they were trying to encourage people to do anything that they could do to destabilize South Africa. By this time, the ANC was not located. They were not headquartered in South Africa, of course. They were in exile. Their goal was to make South Africa ungovernable. The South African military forces were battling not just in South Africa, but also in neighboring countries, as far away as Angola. And by the way, who were they fighting in Angola? Cubans from Castro's regime, who were proxies. The Castro, Havana, they were getting funded by Moscow. They had their troops in Africa. And so Cuban troops were fighting against South African forces. So just to kind of let you know what's going on, they leave a lot of this out, but very clearly the South African forces were battling communists. And that's a whole nother story, because it's 2018 and too many young people do not understand how bad the term communist is. But again, that would probably be a topic for another podcast. Okay, so the ANC took a Marxist-Leninist turn. They abandoned peaceful and started working on violent means. And specifically, they were terrorists. There were random bombings. There had been random mines in rural areas. There were farm attacks, which were attacks on commercial properties. There was necklacing. The ANC was saying two different things to two different audiences. To the liberals within South Africa and to the West, they were trying to act like all they wanted was peace and equality. But to their own people, they were instigating the worst kind of violence. They wanted South Africa to be ungovernable. That word comes up. Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela's wife, kind of slipped up because she said the wrong thing to the wrong audience and admitted in the presence of Western observers that they were necklacing and that was how they were going to liberate South Africa. And then, of course, that caused a problem and they had to disavow her remarks. But the fact of the matter is the necklacing genie was out of the bottle. At first, the necklacing was of black police officers, local government officials who were black that were cooperating with the apartheid regime. The ANC wanted these people out of the way. They wanted them gone, traitors, enemies of the people, die in a brutal manner. Very quickly, though, the crime escalated, and it got to the point where people were settling personal scores with necklacing. And it got to the point in some of the black communities that all you had to do was hold up a book of matches at somebody to make your point. Of course, that's how that kind of violence always goes, isn't it? And in amongst this war, you had attacks by militia-type groups, by guerrilla forces, Guerrilla type of forces, on commercial farms. Okay. By the late 80s, by the early 90s, the world had turned against the apartheid regime because apartheid was wrong. And despite this, South Africa was still struggling along. However, the people in South Africa had begun to realize that they did not want, and when I say the people, I'm talking about the voting people, okay, and that means the whites. They had the political power, and they were realizing they did not want apartheid. They started to feel apartheid was wrong. They voted to end it. So I want to be very clear. There was one generation that started apartheid. There was another generation that ended it peacefully. They voted to end it. And so South Africa held elections in which everybody pretty much could vote. It wasn't just the white folks. And the majority of the people are black. They voted for the ANC because they felt like the ANC had saved them from apartheid. It changed it. And of course, Nelson Mandela, he got out of prison, and now he was president of South Africa. And everybody had these high hopes that it's going to be a rainbow nation. And we're talking about rainbow. There's, in an American perspective, a lot of times perhaps we're thinking, when we're looking at Africa, we're thinking white and black. But looking at the South African demographics from a South African perspective, there's whites, blacks, coloreds, and Asians. Coloreds are people who are some kind of a mixture. They're not purely African descent, but they're not purely European descent. And then people of Asian descent, predominantly the main ethnic group there is people of Indian descent, but you also have significant communities of people of Vietnamese descent and people of Chinese descent. Okay. Then, within the black community, the peoples of African descent, again, from an American perspective, blacks are a minority in our country, but when you go to Africa, obviously they're a majority in a lot of places. And the other thing is they're in touch with their cultural roots. That's something that a lot of people came to America. If you take a look at how blacks came to America back in the slave days, they didn't have a lot of chance to protect and maintain their culture and their traditions. But this is not the case in Africa, so you've got different ethnic groups within the black community. So what you have is a lot of diversity. You've got whites, you've got coloreds, you've got Asians, you've got blacks, and then even within the blacks, that's not one demographic. You've got many different nations. If you can kind of think of it, perhaps a parallel would be if you go back and look at the Native American tribes. You've got several different nations, many different nations, even today. And there's some similarities, but a lot of differences among them. Okay. Similar. So a lot of diversity, and people had high hopes that South Africa, with blacks and coloreds, everybody enfranchised, it was going to be this rainbow nation, unity and diversity. Rainbow nation, unity and diversity. And that's what everybody was thinking in the mid-90s. At that time, Nelson Mandela, who was now president, noticed something, that the farm attacks were continuing. Since the war was over, this was no longer a military operation. And now Nelson Mandela was in charge of all of South Africa. He recognized that the farm attacks were a very serious problem. Because when you were attacking commercial farms, you were attacking food supply and food security. You are attacking places that employ people, so it impacts the economy in a number of different ways. And so President Mandela realized he had to prioritize the farm attacks as something that they were going to have to deal with. But why were the farm attacks continuing? Well, if you go back and take a look, something that's not really widely known in the historical record, when the ANC was in exile, there go a couple of vehicles behind me on the highway. When the ANC was in exile, they became corrupt. They turned to organized crime. Do you remember early on in the podcast, I said that Moscow supported pretty much every terrorist movement going in the 1970s, except for the ones that were supported by Beijing? Okay. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was having problems. They were going bankrupt in Afghanistan. They were going bankrupt dealing with the Cold War. President Reagan's strategy was pretty good. Reagan pushed the American economic revival, which the Soviets could not match. Communism cannot match free enterprise economically. They can't. Reagan also pushed a big military buildup, which the communists were big about having their own military, but they cannot keep up with unchained free enterprise. And then on top of that, they were getting their own version of a Vietnam, so to speak, in Afghanistan. And that was very difficult for them. And then, if you recall, Gorbachev came to power, and Gorbachev was kind of a reformer. He was not one of these old school communists. He was the next generation. And he started talking about glasnost, which is being open about the problems that they have. And that led to a perestroika, which is reconstructing, rebuilding communism. And as a result of that, Moscow just didn't have the money to be giving out to all of these terrorists. They were going bankrupt. But also, funding all of this terrorism was not a smart move, because if they really wanted to start that, the United States could cause them problems, as we were by supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So terrorists and all of these liberation movements and all these guerrillas started to realize that their source of funding was drying up. What could they do? Well, also, if you remember, for those of you that were around, the 80s was the era of cocaine. Remember the TV show Miami Vice and all that other stuff. And for America, we were dealing with cocaine coming up from Latin America. The drug cartels were trafficking cocaine. Cocaine is immensely profitable. And if half of their shipments get intercepted, they're still making money, good money. You can't do that selling apples. If half of your apple crop gets intercepted, you got problems. But cocaine, they could do it. The trouble that the drug trafficking organizations had was that the government forces were stronger. They had money, but they needed troops to battle against the government. Well, a little ways through the jungle, there's this guerrilla terrorist organization, some communist group. They've got troops, but they need money. Are you starting to see which way this is going? Okay, so the drug trafficking organizations contract with the guerrilla groups to provide security for the drug trafficking operations. And so they've rented an army. Now, in return, these organizations now have a sugar daddy to replace Moscow. And the rise of narco-terrorism began. And so the 1980s saw terrorist groups and liberation movements the world over turning to criminal activities for funding. And once you get involved in the criminal activities and you start seeing the money flowing through there, the ideology sometimes doesn't mean so much to you anymore. And so they get a little bit more focused on their criminal activities and the money than they do on spreading communism or whatever it happens to be that they're involved with. Case in point, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, they were based in Jordan, got chased out of Jordan, and set up base in Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley. And there they started producing poppies and making heroin. The PLO was heavily into drug trafficking by the late 70s, early 80s. So much so that the PLO was nicknamed the Poppy Lovers Organization. Yasser Arafat died a rich man. There's real money in terrorism. That's another story. Okay, well, keep in mind, about the same time in the 80s, the ANC was in exile, and they started getting corrupt. They were turning to organized crime, and they started getting corrupt. That corruption has never left. There are good people in the ANC, but there's also a lot of criminals there. There are people who really believe that the ANC's Marxist-Leninist, socialist, communist policies are going to work. And there are other people, they don't care. It just keeps them in power and they're corrupt. Okay, so by the 90s, Nelson Mandela, president of South Africa, is looking at this. These farm attacks are continuing. All right, why are the farm attacks continuing? The reason I painted this picture about the ANC becoming corrupt while they were in exile in the 80s, and the whole situation there, was because somebody, I think, was making some kind of money out of these farm attacks, obviously. So there was a dynamic apart from the political dynamic. Because remember, the political objective of any violence had been achieved once apartheid was ended. There was an election, blacks, coloreds, Asians, everybody was enfranchised. The ANC was voted into power. There was no need for military operations to continue because they'd achieved their political goal. They weren't the guerrilla forces anymore. Now they controlled the South African military. So why were the farm attacks continuing? There was some type of a criminal enterprise going on, or perhaps there was a secret political agenda. Okay, so mid-90s, Nelson Mandela is trying to deal with these farm attacks. All right. Let me talk to you a little bit about the security services in South Africa. Specifically, there was one, it was like a militia, and it was known as the commando system. The commando system was a rural militia, predominantly white people, and it was incorporated into the South African military forces, kind of like the National Guard in a way, except that they were also kind of like militarized police, kind of like gendarmes, and they had an old history, and they would actually participate in law enforcement operations. So, for example, if the law enforcement was going to go do something somewhere, they might mobilize some of the commando units to go set up roadblocks and things of this nature and participate in the law enforcement operation. Okay, because this was a rural-based militia, these people could not go to a central location and get their small arms. They had to have the small arms with them in the rural areas, at these farms, for example. And so they would have a military-grade weapon, and also they'd had some military training at their home. Which means that if somebody attacked them at their home, they had an ability to defend themselves while help was on the way. Nelson Mandela saw that the farm attacks were threatening food security, they were threatening food prices, they were impacting the economy. He saw that it had to be a high priority crime. He prioritized it, and under his leadership, they were looking at the commando system as being a key aspect of rural security. In fact, Nelson Mandela encouraged people to join the commando system, and he specifically encouraged white people to join the commando system. Okay. By the early 2000s, things were changing. There was a new president. I'm probably going to mispronounce his name. Thabo Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki. And under his leadership, a couple of things happened. First of all, keep in mind, farm attacks were a priority crime. In order to be a priority crime, there has to be a particular definition. And so farm attacks were not defined as just a random robbery or just a random murder. They had particular aspects associated with them. I will get to those in a little bit as to what's going on. But the point is that, you know, like a spouse, you know, if you got a married couple and one of them, you know, gets violent with the other, that's not a farm attack. If you've got a rural worker upset at his boss, at the owner, or the boss gets upset at the rural worker, and there's some type of violence, that's not a farm attack. That's part of the social fabric. Farm attacks go in a different category, which is why they can be particularly prioritized. Okay, after President Mandela, they deprioritized the farm attacks, and in fact, they went so far as to stop counting them as a separate category of crime. So now, if something happened on a rural farm, and somebody got killed, you couldn't tell unless you actually went through the reports and read each report in a place where there's terrible murder rate, terrible crime. unless you went through and read each report to find out what was going on, because they were no longer categorizing these as a separate category of crime. It was mixed in with the rest of the statistics. It was aggregated. It was all lumped together. So they stopped counting the farm attacks as a separate crime, as a separate crime category, and implicitly this meant that they were no longer a priority. What else happened, though, is they disbanded the commando system. Now, they had had a recommendation that the commando system be disbanded because the roots of the commando system went back to the apartheid era. And so they thought, well, we need to get rid of this because it just reminds us of apartheid. However, the recommendations, which were made at meetings at which government officials attended, the recommendations were, yes, disband it, but don't disband it until something else is ready to take its place. When you get the follow-on, then disband it. Well, President Mbeki decided to disband it anyway. And so from 2003 to 2008, the commando system was disassembled. Okay, so what's going on here? Under ANC leadership, farm attacks started in the 80s. And then in the early 2000s, under ANC leadership, and I'm going to pause here. You can kind of hear in the background, there's a car going by me, but I don't know if you can hear the donkey. Anyway, the farm attacks started under the ANC in the 80s. And then under ANC leadership in the early 2000s, they deprioritized them. They stopped counting them as a separate category. They just left these farm attacks as part of the high background noise of crime, so you wouldn't notice any type of a spike. They just said it's regular crime. And at the same time, they disbanded the commando system, leaving these rural areas more vulnerable to such attacks. So the same organization that started the attacks then left the victims more vulnerable when in power and stopped keeping track of how many of these attacks are going. To me, that seems like a pattern of conduct. Now, Nelson Mandela is a very controversial figure. I don't want to get into all of that. However, I would point out that he did encourage people, white people, to join, especially white people, to join the commando system, and saw the commando system as a key to rural security, and he prioritized farm attacks. Now, people can question his sincerity and so on. To me, what it looks like is there were two different factions. There was the Mandela, people that thought like him, whatever they were thinking during the war, whatever they were thinking, the war was over. And maybe they were actually trying to build a better South Africa for everybody. But obviously there was another faction that was involved in these farm attacks and that now had power to make sure the farm attacks continued. Okay, so that was in the early 2000s. All right, fast forward, it's now Christmas Day 2018. One of the things that got my attention a couple of years ago was I heard a story about the brutality of one of the attacks. A child was drowned in boiling water. I want you to think about that. I've heard different stories. I have not been able to track this particular one down. The best information I've got is that it was about 12 or so, was how old the kid was. A recent attack, fairly well documented, an old man had a towel put over his face, and then boiling water was poured on the towel. So the towel keeps the boiling water there to burn him. when you go back and look at some of these pictures from some of these farm attacks, some of the stuff is bad, it is brutal. There have been a couple of documentaries that have been done recently. Lauren Southern did one, and then Katie Hopkins did one. Both of them address this farm attack phenomenon. All right, if you're interested in more information, take a look at that. I want to now step back and look at the bigger picture here. There's talks about white genocide, and then you wind up having a lot of controversy, and people are shouting past each other. Okay. Use of the term white genocide is misleading, and it's inflammatory, because you conjure up in your mind an image of just white people just getting slaughtered in the streets. The way it was happening, Rwanda and Burundi here a couple of decades ago. People just hacking each other with machetes. Okay, obviously that's not happening. Many of the reports I get from people, they talk about how well everybody gets along. There was a story that I heard the other day. This woman, white woman, color seems to be so important these days. There was this white woman that had a flat tire, and some black guys were coming along, and they saw, and they changed the tire for her. And I get a lot of stories like this. Okay. So if you're listening to people talking about a white genocide, you've got to take that in context. It's got to be nuanced, and you got to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. All right. There's a lot of good people in South Africa. Most of the people there are good, obviously. Okay. Here's the concern. When you take a look at white farmers in commercial areas, there is a very clear spike. 3/4 of them have been driven out of business since apartheid ended. There is ethnic cleansing of the rural farmlands. It's not like they're going around wiping out white people in the cities. On average, white people tend to be a bit safer. But if you take a look at these rural areas, it's really bad for the white commercial farmers. There is very clear ethnic cleansing. And Genocide Watch, run by a fairly respected scholar who used to work as a diplomat under the Clinton administration, there's two different, depending on which of their websites you go to, there's 8 stages of genocide or 10 stages. I'm more familiar with the one that talks about the 10 stages. And they are showing genocide of the white Boer farmers as stage 6 out of 10. And by the way, elements of 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all present. And there are spikes into those as well. So people who are real smart about this, a lot smarter than I am, people who are familiar with genocides, they've looked at Cambodia, they looked at other places, and they seem to take the concern about genocide, not just random genocide of whites, but genocide of white commercial farmers, the so-called Boer. They take that very seriously. And there is a de facto ethnic cleansing going on of the white Boer farmers. The other thing is South Africa has been known for outbreaks of xenophobia. They had a lot of xenophobic violence there about 10 years ago. All right. So the same place, Genocide Watch, is concerned also about xenophobic attacks spiking into genocide. All right. On the one hand, I'm telling you that it can be a little bit inflammatory, to talk about white genocide, but let me come back and address this from the other side here. There's a lot of good people in South Africa, as I've mentioned, and there's a lot of good stories, and sadly we don't hear all the good stories. Good news doesn't seem to make it around the globe. However, it's a murder capital. It's a rape capital. This place is more dangerous than most war zones. There are jurisdictions that are worse than Syria. And remember what I told you about the police getting killed in the line of duty and so on. And a lot of these people suffering from PTSD, and they're committing suicide. There's a high suicide rate. Okay, the good people are having trouble just surviving. The cops are having trouble defending themselves. If there is a spike in violence, the police and all the good people are going to be defending themselves. The police are going to be defending themselves. They're having trouble doing that now. Nobody is going to be able to stop a spike into genocide. So you could see a xenophobic outburst against blacks who aren't from South Africa. They've emigrated, perhaps illegally. You could see that. You have seen that. And you could see it again. Okay, let me go back here and talk about, I mentioned the Boer farmers. I did not explain what that word, Boer, B-O-E-R, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. B-O-E-R, what does that mean? Okay. When white people first arrived in South Africa, basically at Cape Town area, there weren't a lot of people there. The few people that were there, there were a couple of tribes called the Khoi and the San. One was nomadic, the other was like a hunter-gatherer group. By the way, these people weren't black. They kind of resembling Australian Aborigines. And so the Europeans established a colony there. Then, during the Napoleonic era, the British came to govern this colony. And some of these people didn't want to be under British rule. So they left. They pushed out. And if you look at a map, Cape Town is, if you go down to the very southern part of Africa, the southern tip is where South Africa is. It's on the left side, kind of over on the Atlantic coast. Okay? They pushed from there to the northeast. All right. They went out looking for places that they could go where they could be free of British rule. About this time, the Zulus were beginning a conquest of the southern parts of Africa. So the Boer were pushing to the northeast, more east to the north, at about the same time that the Zulu were pushing south and southwest. And the Zulu were conducting conquest. And it was genocidal, by the way. It was ethnic cleansing, genocide, conquest. As the Boer are getting into some of these areas, there's some places that nobody lives there, and then there's some places, obviously nobody's ever lived there. There are some places that it looks like people have lived there, but they're gone now. And then, of course, there are places where there are people living. And then they encountered the Zulu. Okay. One of the popular things that they say right now is they refer to the white people as settlers. And they say, give us our land. And there's a racist component to this. The idea is that if you are black, you have a claim to African land. And if you are white, you do not. They are judging who should own the land based on skin color. And that is racist. It is racist. Use of the term settlers to refer to white people in South Africa is racist. It delegitimizes them. At any rate, as the Boer were arriving in these areas, some places had never been populated, so they went ahead, they established a settlement. Some places had, the people were gone. They couldn't figure out where. They established a settlement. And in some places, they encountered other people, and they worked a deal to live with them. Some of the tribes they were encountering were happy to have the Boer there, because there was this new group called the Zulus coming down, and they were wiping people out and chasing them off the land. And so there's a lot of history here. I'm not going to go into all of it. But the long story short, the Boer occupied land which nobody had occupied before. That's legitimate. They occupied land which had belonged to somebody, but those people were gone. They were either killed by the Zulus or they were driven out by the Zulus, and that land was now vacant. All right, that's legitimate. In some cases, they worked with the local people that lived on the land, and the Boer would give them a bunch of cattle, and in return they would get land that the Boer could establish farms on. That's legitimate. And here's the one that people are going to freak out about. The Zulus were attacking the Boer and some of these other people The Boer fought them off and won, and took some of the land back from the Zulus. The Zulus came down, took some land, attacked the Boer. The Boer kicked their butt and took some of the land from the Zulus. They legitimately occupied it through conquest. And that's legitimate. And the fact that that is legitimate has ramifications for a lot of stuff that's going on today. So at any rate, this whole idea about give us back our land, that land didn't, the people that some of it did belong to had been killed or driven off by the Zulus, not by the Boer. Okay, never mind the history of the 1800s. Never mind that. That was 200 years ago. Not quite 200 years ago that this was going on. A person born in South Africa today, they were maybe born in the 90s. They were born after apartheid. And they were born in the Republic of South Africa. The Rainbow Nation, unity and diversity, all that. ANC ruling. A person born there is a South African. I don't care what skin color they have. It doesn't matter. They're born in South Africa, they're South African. To sit there and say this guy doesn't belong here because he's white, that's racist. That is racist. When they say, well, these white people are settlers. No, they're not. They're South African citizens and they need to be treated like South African citizens. They were born there. Equal protection under the law. That's what ending apartheid was all about. Equal protection under the law, equal opportunity to participate in civil society and government. That's what the whole thing was supposed to be about. And now look at them and say, look, you know, this guy, he's 20 years old, but he's white, so he's a settler. To be a settler, you'd have to be centuries old. Use of the term settlers to refer to white people delegitimizes the white people as citizens, and it sets the stage for ethnic cleansing and genocide. And when you go to Genocide Watch, they don't point out at the word settler, but they do talk about the rhetoric as being one of the things that help set a stage for genocide. That's why South Africa is at 6 out of 10. By the way, I was looking around. I wanted to find out about Genocide Watch. Another country that's 6 out of 10 for what we have done historically is the United States because of what has happened with the Native American tribes. Anybody that thinks that some of that was bad and some of it was needs to take a look at what's going on in South Africa, because we still have a chance to prevent that. Okay, so when we're talking about white genocide, it's a loaded term. You can argue whether or not it accurately reflects the situation. When you look at some of the places where people are getting along great and the crime is very obviously impacting the blacks more than the whites, it's laughable to use the term white genocide. But when you look at how certain communities are impacted, the Boer, and by the way, that word Boer means farmer. When you take a look at how the Boer are being impacted in the rural farming communities, it's very serious. Experts disagree on whether or not a genocide is occurring. My concern is that there's a de facto ethnic cleansing of white people in the rural areas. And my other concern is that with political leaders, mainstream ANC political leaders, using the term settlers to refer to whites, they are setting the stage for further ethnic cleansing. Okay, what else? Well, one of the big pushes right now, there's an election coming up in South Africa, and the ANC wants to stay in power. The next major political opponent is the Democratic Alliance, and they're a little bit more centrist. And then the next biggest one, the third ranking political power there, is the Economic Freedom Fighters, which are militant Marxists. And so you have the ANC, which is way out on the left. Then the number 2 group, which is substantially, weaker, is a little bit more centrist. And then the number 3 group is way out on the left. They're militant Marxists. The EFF is led by a guy named Julius Malema, and I may be mispronouncing his name, and my apologies if I am. Malema was head of the ANC's Youth League, the African National Congress Youth League, ANCYL. And as such, he and the ANCYL received military-type training back about 2010 on South African military bases. Now, imagine what would happen if you took the young people from a political party and gave them military training. Oh my gosh, you'd have something like the communist Komsomol, wouldn't you? Oh my gosh, you'd have something like the Hitler Youth, wouldn't you? Did you know the Hitler Youth actually fleshed out SS divisions? They manned SS divisions, and they actually manned fighter interceptors flying against U.S. bombers and British bombers in World War II. Anyway, so Malema and the ANC Youth League received military training at South African military bases. Malema was a little bit apparently too radical for the ANC. He got booted out, and so he formed his own economic freedom fighters. He has gotten in trouble in South Africa for singing a song, and the lyrics go, "Shoot the Boer, kill the Boer." And he's gotten in trouble for that. That's considered hate speech. And he is the leader of the 3rd most powerful political party. There are other political groups that are calling for extreme measures. There's a whole lot of hate speech out there. One of the things that I've noticed, there's a lot of racist talk, and a lot of stuff that appears to be racist, but I don't think it is. I think there's context. Okay? I think Malema singing "Shoot the Boer," he shouldn't be saying that. When you're going through and you're looking at what people are talking about, with the use of the term settlers, they shouldn't be doing that. You'll see people talk about them, and you'll see that kind of on both sides. That could be construed as a racist term, but it could also be a cultural or a political thing. So if you think you're coming across something that's racist, I suggest keep looking at it and take a look. Context and nuance is everything in the situation with South Africa. Context and nuance is everything. Okay, so that's a lot of information so far, but we're not done. We're not done. I want to give you broader perspective for this and why this should concern Americans. Okay. South Africa has Africa's 2nd largest economy. I believe the largest is Nigeria, right? And it's also the most developed. One of the things that apartheid left South Africa is the apartheid government made it a first world country with remarkable infrastructure. There's roads, there's railroads, there's nice port facilities. And so South Africa has Africa's 2nd largest, but also the most developed economy. Also, if you take a look at the location, it sits at the tip of Africa between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. So it is a natural stop, which is why the colonies were established there to begin with, for east-west trade. Anything that's not going through the Suez Canal or not going by air or land, it's got to go around South Africa. That's the easiest way to get from Europe to Asia and back and forth. So consequently, anything bad that happens there is going to have an impact on world trade. Also, the fact that it's such a well-developed economy with excellent commercial and financial ties to the whole world has made it a target for drug trafficking organizations, DTOs, and organized crime groups, OCGs, but I'm not going to be using those acronyms. Drug traffickers and organized crime use South Africa because you can transship stuff. You can bring stuff into a port, unload it, reload it, pack it up, send it somewhere else. The financial network, they've got their own stock exchange. The financial network is excellent for laundering the proceeds of illegal activity, drug money, for example. Most of the world's heroin is grown in Afghanistan these days. The poppies are grown there. It used to be that they had to ship the raw opium someplace like Turkey for refining into heroin and then send it on to Europe. Those days are gone. It gets refined right on site in Afghanistan. A lot of it down in the Taliban areas along the Durand line, which is the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it gets refined right there. And it's something like 95% of the world's heroin. Depending on who you talk to, that's hundreds of billions of dollars per year. How many hundreds depends on the estimate. Very, very good quality heroin. Very pure. They ship a lot of this stuff up into Russia. Some of that was back during the jihad. That's how the Mujahideen were financing their holy war against the communists. They ship it to Europe, and the Balkans have been the main route about sending heroin to Europe. But of course there's better interdiction, better law enforcement in these places. And so now they're developing what they call the southern route, where they take the heroin out of Afghanistan, take it to Iran or Pakistan, and load it on board some type of seagoing vessel, an Arab dhow, for example. And then they send it by sea. Maybe transship it onto a larger ship, however they do it. And from there it goes in to East Africa, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania. Well, it also comes ashore in Mozambique, and it also comes ashore in South Africa. This is significant now because in South Africa you can unpack it, repack it, put it into containerized cargo, and ship it anywhere in the world. For example, you can ship it to Rotterdam, going from Durban, which is a major port on the east coast of South Africa, to Rotterdam, which is a major European port, transshipment point for containerized cargo. From there, you can send it anywhere, Gdansk, Poland, and then from there unload it, and crap could wind up on the streets of Warsaw. Wherever drugs are moving, drugs become more available, and increased availability means the price comes down, supply and demand, right? And so as increased amounts of drugs move through Africa, and especially South Africa, because South Africa is what we're talking about, the more drugs moving through there, lower price, increased availability, and you're starting to see more drug problems. The heroin is mixed with different types of other stuff, and it's local concoctions, each with its own local name. So a lot of times these people don't realize that what they're calling by one name in one town is basically the same thing as what they're calling by another name in another town. It's all got Afghan heroin in it coming via the southern route. And so consequently, you've got people that are hooked on the drugs. Some people have a job and they work just to get their drugs. But another phenomenon you have is, well, how do junkies pay for drugs? Well, street crime. And so part of the reason why the crime is so bad is people are resorting to crime to get the money that they need to get their fix that they so desperately need. Another thing that drives is control over the distribution networks. And so you'll have gangs fighting over who's going to control the shipments going through South Africa to Europe, or who's going to control distribution in this town or distribution in that town. And as drug gangs get fighting over that, it gets violent. And so the murder rate goes up. You know, they'll be shooting each other outside of a nightclub or whatever it happens to be. And so you're seeing a lot of this. And of course, the heroin money, gets into people's campaigns. Some places in Africa, they have people that are basically affiliated with drug cartels that are getting elected to public office. Okay, that money is flowing through South Africa now. Okay, what else? Well, South Africa itself, we've talked about it, its location being very strategic and very significant. We've talked about the economy being very well developed and very large. But another thing, tremendous mineral resources. We probably all know about the gold and diamonds. But there's iron, nickel, cobalt, just an incredible wealth of minerals. And these are the things that people need to fuel modern industries. China is trying to pull a lot of the raw resources out of Africa, send them to China, manufacture things, and then they're hoping to turn around and take their manufactured goods and sell them in Africa. And by the way, this has some pushback from Africans because they see that they're basically getting exploited in a kind of a colonial manner. You go to some places and the Chinese government has worked a deal. There's Chinese guys giving the orders and taking orders from Beijing and giving the orders. Chinese people doing the work and jobs that could go to Africans, and they're not going to Africans, and Africans are upset about that, and understandably so. But at any rate, a lot of mineral wealth there to fuel the world's industries, and that's what's at stake. And not just in South Africa, but also Zimbabwe. And we have to, I hope you're looking at a map. Probably should have done this earlier on. South Africa, as I mentioned, is at the tip of Africa. On the Atlantic coast, bordering it, is Namibia. Then in the center is Botswana, which borders both Namibia and South Africa, right? And then as you move over, you've got Zimbabwe. South Africa completely encloses Lesotho. And you may remember from your geography class a country called Swaziland. It's now called Eswatini. The king just changed the name here a little while ago. It's almost completely surrounded by South Africa. And it borders on Mozambique, which is on the coast. And then right off the coast is Madagascar. And then as you go up the coast from Mozambique, all right, now you've got Tanzania and Kenya and Somalia. And then, of course, as you move north from Namibia and Botswana and Zimbabwe, that's when you get into Zambia towards the east, and then DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, is farther up there. All right. Why am I mentioning this? Botswana is a pretty good ally of ours. We have joint military exercises with them. Very stable. Very straight. There's not a lot of corruption there or anything like that. They're developing very good infrastructure, good tourism. Mainly they're producing, they've got a lot of diamonds and gold also, some of the mineral wealth. They're trying to develop their coal. Namibia on the coast, on the Atlantic coast, similar situation, not quite as close to us as Botswana, but very good infrastructure. Also, Namibia has excellent port facilities on Walvis Bay. Okay, so Namibia and Botswana are the success stories in the area. Lesotho is having trouble. Eswatini is having trouble. Mozambique, they're developing gas up in the northeasternmost province, but that also happens to be an area subject to an Islamic insurgent group called Al-Shabaab. Now, that's the same name as these guys in Somalia, but from what we can tell, it's totally different groups. And Mozambique also happens to be a place that they're bringing the heroin through via the southern route. Okay, Zimbabwe tried their luck with land reform, and it went bad. A lot of murder going on, and just totally destroyed their agricultural, and they're starting to realize what a mistake it was. Ooh, land reform. I didn't mention that. Yeah. The ANC, as I started talking about the politics and then went off on a different tangent, the ANC, with the elections coming up, is hoping to stay in power. One of the things that they're pushing is expropriation without compensation. They are in the process of amending the South African Constitution. They're telling everybody that they're amending it so that they can take land because it's all land, and the whole racist idea that if you're black, you should own land, and if you're white, you shouldn't. Okay, and so they're trying to amend the Constitution to very explicitly be able to take land. But you see, it's kind of interesting because the part of the Constitution is Article 25, which really doesn't need to be amended, and they admit that it doesn't need to be amended for them to take land in the interests of some type of, social, ethnic justice. As I'm reading through the proposed amendment, and by the way, this is a proposed amendment process. It's just basically a rubber stamp. The ANC, together with the EFF, control enough of the government, and their process to amend the Constitution is such that it's going to happen. It's just a question of time. It's going to get rubber stamped. It's going to happen. And so they're saying that they need to amend the Constitution to explicitly be able to take land and redistribute it. Well, the proposed amendment states in there, it talks about land and it talks about stuff that is not tangible property. Experts have looked at it, and as I'm going through this proposed amendment myself, I have to come to the same conclusion. The expropriation without compensation, EWC, is not about land. It's going to let them take anything they want from anybody. It's going to let them take intellectual property. And where have we seen this before? Well, the communists did this by force in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and it was just another disaster on top of the disaster they were already creating, resulted in famine and so on. But you also might want to take a look at Cyprus. The communists were voted into power there. And communists do not understand economics. That's why communist countries are crap holes until they get away from Marx's philosophy. And so as Cyprus used to have a very good banking industry and all that, well, once the communists got into power, they just wanted to take the money from the banks. And so, you know, if you're an American listening to this, or if you're following American news and politics, you know what a bailout is. It's where the government gives money to their buds in some industry because that industry or that particular company is not so competitive and they're losing money. So you take taxpayer money and they give it to these guys and maybe lend it to them or whatever. So at any rate, a bailout is government giving money to private sector. Okay, so a bailout is government giving money to the private sector. What do you think a bail-in is? Exactly. Government taking money from the private sector. So for example, taking money from the banks. So when government doesn't have enough money, they do a bail-in. They take it from the banks. Well, who gets the bill for that? Well, if you're a depositor in the bank, you do. I'm going to introduce you to another term. It's called haircut. If you're a depositor and you got, $1,000 or 1,000 euros in this bank, and they do a bail-in, and they take 30% of the money from that bank for the government, then the depositors each lose 30% of their, instead of having $1,000, you now have 700, or instead of having 1,000 euros, you now have 700 euros. Okay? That's called taking a haircut. So a bail-in is the opposite of a bailout, and you pay for it with a haircut. I'm not making this up. Okay? And this EWC, expropriation without compensation, it's not just about farmland and giving land to people. It's about taking whatever they want from whomever for whatever reason. Now, understand, they keep talking about, well, the settlers are on our land. Well, the settlers, we got to take land, it's about our land. Give us our land, you're white, you shouldn't have any. All right. To be sure, not all the people in South Africa agree with this nonsense, but there's enough of them fanning the flames of it because they see that their own political fortunes could rise with this and get them elected, get them reelected. If the EFF pushes hard enough, maybe they're going to be the majority party. You kind of see what they're doing. It's all political. They like to float around the idea of trying to say that, well, whites own 70% of the land. That's blatant hogwash, okay? They have never really done a good survey. And then, so when you go back and look at it, the figures I've seen is like whites who comprise 8% of the population own more like 22% of the land. And then you've got to question, well, what are we talking about by owning the land? Is owning an acre, out in the middle of nowhere near the Kalahari Desert the same as owning an acre of prime farmland near the coast? Is owning an acre of land or whatever unit of measure they're using in a vineyard near Cape Town in the mountains the same as owning an acre out in the middle of nowhere? Is owning an acre along a river the same as owning an acre in a very desolate and dry place, borderline desert, range country? So there's a lot of aspects of this that they're using bad numbers, they're using bad statistics, they're basically changing the story as they want to in order to come up with the result that they want, which is we are going to take land from that minority whom we are demonizing. We're calling them settlers. We're demonizing them. We're going to take their stuff. We're going to tell you we're going to give it to you in order to buy your vote to stay in power. And what's going to really happen to the land? What is really going to happen to the land? And remember, we're not just talking about land, but what's going to really happen to the land? Well, if you go take a bunch of people that are living in poverty, and they don't have a job, and they're frustrated, and you give them a farm, do they magically know how to farm? Because you have to know how to farm, and you have to have a passion for it. It's tough work. And so that's not going to work very well. When they tried it in neighboring Zimbabwe, what happened is a lot of the people just went in, they would dig up the irrigation systems and sell it as scrap metal. And now you don't have productive farmland anymore. And famine and food insecurity and all that other crap. Okay. That's one aspect of this. Another thing they could do is they could take it from those demonized evil settlers and then work some kind of a deal for an international conglomerate to come in. And if you go look at what these conglomerates are doing in places like South America and elsewhere in Africa, they're very vertically integrated. They own everything from the place that's producing the food to the transportation that's taking it to get processed, to the processing plant, to the distribution networks, to the stores. And basically, I mean, from field almost to your table, they control the whole thing. When it gets that vertically integrated, you can kind of have some monopolistic practices that develop, and that impacts price and it impacts quality. Prices go up, quality goes down. It can, doesn't have to be that way, but a lot of times it is. Also, in places where you've got so much corruption, and the ANC is corrupt, I think I mentioned that, there's terrible impact on the environment. As I've been digging around, I'm looking at the impact that they're having now because of iron and nickel mining. So it's not going to work just to give land to people, the poor black folks in the townships. That's not going to work. It might have some measure of success, although there will be a dip in production as some international conglomerate comes in to take over for this Boer family that's been there for a couple hundred years. Is that really what they're trying to do? Is that really what you want? Because who's going to get rich off that? It's not going to be the poor black guys in the farm, in the township. The farm workers are going to be just maybe wind up, if they're lucky, they're going to wind up working for the new boss. And otherwise, who's going to get rich off that? The politician cutting the deal. That's how that works. That's how corruption works. It's how it works in New York City. It's how it works in Chicago. And that's how it works in Johannesburg and Pretoria and Cape Town. The other option would be mining. Bring in some international conglomerate, not to farm it, but to mine it. I think I mentioned all the minerals that are there. Ooh, let's go back and talk some more about the minerals that are there. There's a lot of coal. South Africa is known to produce coal. They've got coal-fired power plants, but for some reason, being such a coal-producing country, and for all of the coal-fired power plants, they have something called, what is that term? We call it rolling brownouts or whatever. What do they call it? Load shedding. It's when they cut power on you for hours and hours. If you're lucky, you have power 6 hours a day. There's load shedding. In a place that's got that much coal, and they've got load shedding. Meanwhile, ship after ship after ship of coal leaves Durban for China. But never mind that. Don't want to go there. So the other option is to bring in some international conglomerate to do the mining. And by the way, guess what language those people are going to be speaking if they do that? Okay? The coal's going to China. A lot of the minerals are going to China. Guess who's going to be making money along with the ANC? It's not going to be the French. Okay? Okay, so we've painted a pretty big picture here now. Let me try to tie some of this together. The key points here, there's a very high crime rate, and it's getting fueled by heroin trafficking along the southern route. That heroin money also fuels corruption, and there's also a very high corruption rate. We're talking about this happening in a country where it's got a murder rate, violent death rate that's on a par with war zones, and certain jurisdictions are worse than war zones. We're talking about a country where the law enforcement cannot defend themselves. This is in the second largest and most developed economy, astride critical trade routes, sitting on top of incredible mineral wealth and a great deal of coal. And by the way, yes, there is a presence of petroleum. They've got some offshore that they've tapped. There's also some offshore that they haven't tapped yet, and they have some potential for some unconventional petroleum. But it's not a big player. It's not a big player. The minerals are more important. Any petroleum there would probably be more incidental in nature at this point anyway. Okay. And by the way, they have had an incident of Islamic terrorism. Durban, the port city on the Indian coast that I talked about, they had some bombings which they've now tied into people trying to align themselves with the Islamic State. And Islam itself does have a presence. In fact, if you go look on the other coast near Cape Town, there's a very old neighborhood. It's close, and I forget the name of this place, but it's close to being like a World Heritage Site because of the presence there. They're surrounded by properties that the price is going up, and so they're trying to look at what they can do to protect this certain part of town, and it happens to include a small presence of Muslims. All right, why is that significant? We know we've got a problem with Islamic terrorism in Somalia. We know that there's a group in Mozambique. It's indigenous Islamic terrorism. Doesn't seem to be tied to any type of a world movement or anything like that. But then there is a presence, very, very small at this point, and very limited potential for growth at this point. However, should South Africa become destabilized, one thing that some of these militant extremist Muslims are good at doing is coming in and giving the semblance of stabilizing and bringing about law and order. You know, the Islamic State sprouted up in a civil war, for example. Okay. How much traction would they get? Well, sometimes some of these folks get some traction when they go into prison and try to convert people who are in prison for violent crimes. So there's some potential there. But regardless of that, the main thing that I'm looking at, there's the corruption, there's the heroin, there's the high crime rate. This expropriation without compensation, it's the wrong path. It's being taken for the wrong reasons. It's being taken, they're trying to do it for racist reasons. The reality is that somebody's going to make money off of it. When that happens, the political rhetoric is taking a place that is already at stage 6 of 10 for genocide, and it could drive it into a genocidal spike, and also a xenophobic spike of crime. All of these things together, it could destabilize it, civil unrest, maybe civil war, perhaps a genocidal civil war. The attacks on food security and food prices could then drive famine. Famine could drive refugees. If South Africa starts coming unglued, Lesotho is going to come apart, Eswatini is going to come apart, Mozambique is struggling, Zimbabwe has had a lot of problems. Okay, Botswana and Namibia would need a Western, read U.S. presence in order to stabilize it and hold it at the border. A lot of bad things that could happen. If the U.S. does not go in to stabilize this, China's going to have to do something because they're getting so many of their resources from South Africa. And they're not going to have the power projection ability to go in like the West does, like the U.S. does. They're not going to be able to fly in to a couple of nice airfields up in Botswana. There's an 8,000-foot asphalt airfield down near the South African border, and then there's a 13,000-foot asphalt field up in a tourist area up by some national park farther up. China's not going to be able to just fly stuff in like the U.S. could do. So China's going to be able to bring in enough guys to protect certain critical lines of communication and certain critical resources. And the rest of the country, well, is just too bad. And China, it looks like they're already trying to allow themselves for options with what they're doing around the world, mainly, obviously, in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, cultivating ties, lines of communication bases, Pakistan area. Also, they've got one in the Horn of Africa. And it looks like they're kind of getting their ducks lined up in case at some point in the future they have to intervene militarily in Africa. Also, there are reports that I have not been able to confirm. They all seem to get traced back to the same guy. However, the guy seems to be fairly credible. His source was anonymous, but regardless, it's an unconfirmed report that China has moved in the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile system into Zimbabwe. And if that is in fact present, then who controls it? Is it the Chinese or is it the Zimbabwe? Doesn't really matter. The point is that it's roughly a poor man's Patriot, and there's nothing there to shoot at with it, except maybe the South African Air Force, but there's no beef between South Africa and Zimbabwe. The only reason that missile system could be there, assuming it's there, is in case the West would intervene, for example, humanitarian or stabilization operations, if South Africa comes apart. So there it is, folks. At this point, I'm over an hour and a half, but I think I've given you a fairly good overview as to what's going on in South Africa. If South Africa comes apart, in my opinion, it's going to destabilize the entire Indian Ocean coast, dominoes, who knows how far, Lesotho, Eswatini, Mozambique probably. What's going to happen in Tanzania? What's going to happen in Kenya? What's going to happen in Somalia? I don't know. It's going to go inland. Zimbabwe is going to have problems. Botswana and Namibia will need Western help to hold it at the border. And even then it's going to have an impact on them. In my opinion, it could destabilize one-third of Africa. Worst case scenario, you could see unrest and more military, more hostility, stuff like that, all the way up to Somalia. Worst case scenario. Obviously, best case, nothing happens. I would like that best case to happen by the West paying attention to what's going on and letting the ANC know that ethnic cleansing and genocide will not be tolerated, and that for them to use the term settler promotes it, and that they will be held personally accountable for fanning the flames of ethnic cleansing and genocide, that they need to provide protection to all South Africans of whatever skin color, whatever religion, whatever tribe, whatever ethnicity, that the farm attacks need to end. Genocide and ethnic cleansing, that is a legitimate international interest. Heroin trafficking, legitimate international interest. Some additional recommendations is that they look at free enterprise, because that is what works at getting economies moving and getting people up out of poverty. I think South Africa needs to bring back the commando system for rural security. There's some other things that they could do. There's one thing we haven't talked about here, and I want to be thorough. Squatters camps. If you Google South African squatters camps, you see pictures of white people there. This really ticks off a lot of the blacks, because for every white person in a squatters camp, there's 385 blacks. And so you got all these black people in squatters camps, and then you Google a picture and it shows you white people. And that's another thing that kind of ticks people off, and understandably so. Some of the South Africans have pointed out, well, hey, these are people that have entered the country illegally looking for work. Okay, well, I feel bad for them, and I'm not one of these open borders kind of guys, all right? I don't agree with, the Pope on that. But if China is interested in those minerals, and then that's fine. That's fine if they want to bring that stuff in. Here's something that they could do for those squatters camps. They could go in and the ANC, the government of South Africa, could negotiate with China a deal whereby for every one of those squatters camps, the Chinese construct some type of a daytime facility where people can go in and get a hot meal, that they construct a school, that they construct a clinic, and that they construct a police station so that there's some legitimate police presence. And so that every one of those squatters camps can have police protection, a clinic, a school for the kids, and a place where the people can go and get some hot meals. And that would be a drop in the bucket, cost-wise, compared to the resources that China's pulling out of Africa. And that's something that they could do and should do. And the ANC should negotiate that and insist on that. And if the ANC isn't going to insist on that, then South Africans need to vote for somebody who's going to insist on it. And then what South Africa does with their borders, that's their business. Personally, I'm in favor of border control along our southern border. But that's an issue for South Africans. But that is something that the ANC definitely needs to do for the people that are there. Or whoever's in charge there needs to do that. They need to clean up the corruption. And like I said, heroin is an international concern. And as an American sitting here, ethnic cleansing and genocide will not be tolerated. We didn't do anything in Rwanda and Burundi. We've let a lot of these things happen in Africa and elsewhere. And whatever happened to the words never again? Because it has happened so many times since we said never again. When are we going to actually mean that? And I'm talking to the ANC about this thing with China. See, the ANC is looking towards Beijing. While many of the people in South Africa look towards Western Europe, North America, they're looking west. The ANC looks to Beijing because the Chinese Communist Party is a successful example of one-party rule. And the ANC is kind of looking at that like, maybe we can make this work for us here. Okay. That's up to you to discuss with your voters. But maybe you can get your buddies in Beijing to take care of those 5 million people in squatters camps, black and white, 385 blacks for every white in a squatters camp. Have the Chinese build, like I say, a daytime facility where people can get a hot meal, a school, a clinic, and a police station for every one of those squatters camps. They're very lucky because South Africa has inherited from the apartheid era a very good infrastructure system. Something else I wanted to mention, crime is so bad that infrastructure gets attacked. It gets to the point that people go in and they rip up the rails from commuter trains, try to sell this stuff as scrap. Commuter trains will have somebody driving and they'll have guards, and they've had incidents where the people driving the train and the guards get killed on duty during the crime. 25% of the people in South Africa are unemployed, and they're living off actually I think it's 27%, and they're living off the equivalent of about $1.25 a day. Now think about that, because that's pretty bad. For people who have jobs, they're literally risking their lives commuting. And then meanwhile, the families are left at home in communities that are flooded with drugs and crime. They can do better than that. South Africa can do better than that, and they should do better than that. And absolutely, these farm attacks have to stop. By the way, I never got back to it. What exactly is a farm attack? Well, there is a high crime rate, and there are some incidents that it's hard to tell if that's just separate crime. But considering that the farms were particularly targeted by the insurgency during the apartheid era, farm security has gotten better over the course of the past few decades, such that these farms now have security systems. A lot of the farmers are armed. By the way, South African government trying to take their guns. But in some of these attacks, and there's a guy by the name of Christopher Gumbi, C-R-I-S, all right, it's not C-H-R-I-S if you go to look him up, did his master's thesis last year, 2017, on the farm attack phenomenon. And there's a lot of documentation if you can track it down. The farm attacks are a particular type of crime. These guys, these attackers, tend to be highly trained, as if they've had some military training. They go in with military-grade weapons. That includes radio jammers and cell phone jammers, so that the farms can't call for help. Sometimes they just shoot and then leave. That's not robbery. Sometimes they get in and they conduct the raid, they conduct the attack, and they make off with the equivalent of, $40. Okay, you're not buying cell phone jammers, radio jammers, and military-grade weapons for $40. These guys, on occasion, have been known to police up their spent brass, their shell casings, and then they go running off. They clean up the evidence and then hustle off to an exfiltration point, change clothes, and there's a car waiting there. Folks, they're not doing that for $40. All right? But that's what they're pulling sometimes on these farm attacks. All right? It would have to be a major drug trafficking or organized crime group behind it, or else it has to be a militia that's government sponsored. And a lot of these attackers, they brag about the fact they're never going to do time. They're connected. And so that leans in the direction of they're sponsored by somebody in the government. Somebody in the government's got an agenda. Drive those farmers off that land, expropriate it. Why? So you can make a buck off it, so you can sell it or lease it to some international conglomerate or to somebody who's going to come in and mine it for minerals. Why? After the people have stopped resisting and they've already told them, here's the combination safe, here's where my weapons are, these guys stay and they torture them sometimes for hours. It has been known to happen that they stay there for a day or more, brutally torturing. I'm going to spare you all the details, but like I said, that one man had a towel put on his face, and they poured boiling water on the man's towel on his face. And like I say, Katie Hopkins and Lauren Southern did videos on that. You can get these for free on YouTube, and they've documented some of this, but it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. The very clear intent, and in that master's thesis that Gumbi did, the very clear intent is terroristic intimidation. And so that harkens back to the 1980s when the farm attacks got started. When I first started looking at this, I started to think maybe there's a drug connection to it, and everybody was telling me, no, it's government militia. I've had people try to tell me, well, maybe I'm onto something with the drug trafficking connection, and I'm starting to think, no, this has got to be government, some type of sponsor and corrupt people in the government. Because if your agricultural community is getting targeted in your country and it's impacting, by the way, the increased security on farms means increased overhead, means increased food prices. Farmers going out of business because they're afraid for their lives. They're afraid their kid is going to get drowned in boiling water, or they're going to have their kneecap drilled after they've given the guy what he wants. All right. Any national government, even a corrupt one, even a bad one, even the communists aren't going to put up with that kind of crap. The Soviet Union, if you'd have tried that on a collective farm in the Soviet Union, the KGB would have ridden you. They'd have had you. Who's behind this? And why is it that the South African president came to the UN and denied that it was happening? Did he just misspeak? It happens. Or is there a pattern of conduct here? Because that's the same president who said a couple of decades ago as a policy paper that they were going to slowly turn up the temperature and boil the whites like frogs. And so since I found out about that, I've been putting as a tag, hashtag frog boiler in a lot of my tweets. Hashtag capital F, ROG, capital B, OILER. By the way, those hashtags, they work if you capitalize or not, it doesn't matter. But I capitalize it so it's easier to read two different words. So, ladies and gentlemen, there it is. The frogs are getting boiled, alive, drowned in boiling water. And there's a potential impact on U.S. national security. Because if that place goes, it's going to destabilize a third of Africa, and that's going to be a very critical third of stride shipping lanes with potential for organized crime and terrorist groups to get involved, and sitting on top of so many of the minerals critical to world industry. South Africa. Please keep an eye on it. All right, well, Merry Christmas. Big Mark out.